to the Talent Optimization Podcast, the go-to podcast for CEOs and HR professionals wanting to bridge the gap between the strategy and tactical implementation of talent optimization within their organizations. Through interviews, predictive index, and personal experience, your host, Tracy Shirk, helps you discover the facets of talent optimization from both a CEO and HR perspective to truly create the dream team for your organization. Are you ready? Let's get started.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Talent Optimization. Today, we are chatting about performance leadership and accountability. And we have with us Cheryl Johnson, who's the Chief Human Resource Officer for Paylocity. And Cheryl has been with Paylocity for about 3 years and done some absolutely amazing things with her culture and the way that she specifically leads. So Cheryl, welcome.
Thank you. And happy Friday.
Yeah, happy Friday. I love Fridays, right?
Yeah, me too.
We get to take one hat off and put another hat on. But I think now so much of what we're doing from working from home, the things are so blended. So I'm so curious, how have you set up a culture where that performance is blended in with how individuals are showing up to work every day and their kids and their dogs and their husbands and all the things?
You know, since the pandemic started, trying to figure out how to manage performance in a state where people are constantly distracted. How do you uphold a certain degree of performance standards while also recognizing that performance is going to be different? And then what is different that's because of the distractions? What's different because it's genuine non-performance? And how do you differentiate? And it's something at Paylocity that, I've certainly been talking to, my team who's responsible for HR and then responsible for working with leaders and helping leaders manage through their departments about delineating those two factors. And it really is about understanding that performance will be different. People are distracted. You need to define different performance standards that are not what they used to be, which used to be about, I call it butts in seats. Like if I can see you and your butt's in the seat, I know you're there. And therefore I kind of think you must be performing. But when you can't see people and then they're distracted, you have to be a lot more crisp about what is the outcome you need someone to deliver. And then don't micromanage that outcome. That outcome, if they get it at 2:00 in the morning or, at 5 a.m., because that's the few windows that they have time to get certain things done. If the outcome is crisp and they're achieving the outcome, to give grace to the how they're going to get that outcome has been one of the big things that we've had tons of conversations about. We've built leadership training to support it. We've built manager workshops, and I would call them HR meetings in a box, where it's some guidelines to leaders on how to think about performance differently in such a crazy era.
Yeah. And I love the fact that you just talked about the distinction between outputs, like a butt in a seat, and the outcome of here's that thing that we want, right? That accountability of how much of what by when, right?
Yes, entirely.
And I love when we can break it down to that how much of what by when. And it's like, I don't care when you do it or how you do it, but here's what we're looking for. And it puts so much emphasis in a way back on the manager to clearly delineate what is it that we're actually asking you to do.
Yeah. It was back in early August when it became more evident that schools were going to be virtual. A lot of schools, right? There was going to be a combination. I was fortunate. My kids were in-person instruction, thank goodness. But many people had their kids virtually learning or hybrid learning, which really made their situation really challenging. And so we came into August, we're like, okay, we can't just tell our employees, figure it out. We know you've got your kid at school or your kid at home sitting next to you that you're trying to help them with online instruction and you're trying to work. What will happen is we will have people exiting the workforce because they will have to choose between educating their kids and working. And that's not a choice people were making before. They were making a choice of, working or being available during the day. And it's a very different decision-making process. So we didn't want people to unnecessarily exit the workforce. And we also didn't want people to have burnout and all the things associated with that. So we asked our departments, can you think through working differently in a way that enables your employees to still perform and still handle all the different things that they have coming at them? My favorite example was within our implementation team. The leader of that group, she really worked with her team and said, can we actually break out the work that needs to be done? So the different pieces of the process, instead of saying you have to manage this process from start to finish and there's no exception within it, it's like break down the entire process. And are there parts of the process that are not time sensitive, that can be done at 2 a.m, can be done at 5 a.m, can be done on a Saturday, that does not require interaction with another person, so it can be done at any point in time. And then what are parts of the process also that don't require that in-person interaction? So someone might be able to have their screen off and be quickly handling, showing something to their kid and getting back to work. And then what are the parts that are truly more in-person and intensive? And they broke out those pieces of the work. And then they were able to go back to their teams and say, okay, who really needs an accommodation right now because your kids are young, or you have an elderly parent that you're taking care of, or whatever the circumstance was, who really needs an accommodation where they need to be able to work whenever they can. They need to be off screen. They need to not be talking to people. And can we give those employees this work? And so we did that. So we gave the employees this accommodation, said, here's the work, we're carving it out. And then the rest of the employees who didn't need those accommodations were able to handle the other pieces of the work process. So it certainly wasn't how we would structure it if everything was perfect and there was no issues that you had to accommodate for. But looking at saying, how do we do things differently so that we can retain people, we can give people reasonable performance expectations, keep the business going, and avoid burnout.
And I love that. And I love how you pulled all the different pieces in, right? We're going to avoid burnout because we're going to engage our employees the way they need to work, both from that behavioral perspective of here's what the job is, here's what you need as a person. How do we tie those things together? Now let's layer on top this pandemic and working from home and kids and whatnot, so that we're showing you that we care about the whole person, because the whole person comes to work. And we definitely see that so much more now.
Totally.
One of the things that I've so loved about the pandemic is we can see individuals for who they are and where they are in life, right? Like I just got to meet Coco. I love that.
Yes.
For those of you who aren't seeing the video, because you're not, Coco is Cheryl's dog and he's super cute. So we were able to see the cats running across the screen, or, the kiddos up on the lap and whatnot, to really get that peek into someone's life in a way that if we approach this in the way that we're bringing the whole person to work and we have to take care of that well-being of the whole person, they're going to trust us as well. So I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think back to before the pandemic, and I used to talk about the fact that social media really broke down the barriers between your work life and your personal life, because a lot of leaders would have employees who want to follow them on Facebook and follow them on Instagram. And so it was like this interesting blend where there was an advantage to being approachable. There's an advantage to letting your employees see you as a human being. And I remember having this conversation with some more, I would call them traditional leaders, who were brought up in the era of nope, work life and personal life are completely separate. You don't integrate the two. And the reality is, at that time with just social media, that wasn't the case. You were actually missing out on creating better connections if you weren't using social media to connect with your employees. And that was an argument then. Now, it's even more amplified, where there's no choice. You don't have a choice but to be actually a human with your employees. And I love that. I think it is such a gift. If you look at the pandemic and say, wow, it really created a lot of disruption that was not positive. And on the flip side, there were so many gifts that came out of it. I think the gift of proving that humanizing yourself to your team and your employees and your workforce can be extraordinarily valuable. It makes you a person, and then it also humanizes the people you're working with. It's much harder to be seeing your employees on the screen and seeing what's going on in their background and not be thoughtful of the impact of your decisions on an employee, because they're there. You see them, you see their life behind them. So I love the humanizing approach of the blending. And I also hope that's to stay, that people start realizing that it's actually a good thing for society, like truly for society, for kids and family to be integrated into the things that you do. On the flip side, it is hard to separate. And so it is harder to separate out the kind of building those boundaries around making sure that your work doesn't infuse itself too much into your personal life, just like you don't want too much distraction from your personal life into your work. Did I answer your question? I think I went on a rant and I'm not even sure if I got to the...
Yeah, you definitely did. And that one, it's an integration, but two, it's as leaders knowing that authenticity and sharing ourselves and really encouraging others to do the same allows us to build that trust in the workplace. Yeah. And as we create those teams, if I can trust you and know what's going on, I'm going to have more empathy if something crazy happens. That, hey, we're all going to kind of step up to the plate to do those things so that we can lead and get the business results that we need to be successful. And if we don't know what's happening with that individual, it's really hard to have that empathy and to have that authenticity with that.
When the pandemic first started, I had never really worked from home. Like if I worked from home, it was more just like, I have a doctor's appointment, I'm going to work from home for a couple hours before my appointment and then come in. So I didn't even have a space in my house at the time to work. So I took over a corner of my bedroom and took my 7-year-old's desk from his office and put it in like a corner. And I was like in this little nook. And I felt like at the beginning, it was really important for me to demonstrate to our workforce that I am going through the same thing they're going through. And so I had my kids draw art all the time because I had a blank wall behind me. So I moved in the middle of the pandemic. By the time I had a blank wall behind me, so you couldn't see anything. So I had the kids like draw art, and every week I would change the artwork, but the drawings that my kids would make. And so that people knew, like, I have kids, I have distraction, I'm just like you in that regard. And then my kids would come in to the screen and I wouldn't shush them off. I wouldn't push them away. And my favorite example of like, you kind of build that trust by showing people I'm going through what you're going through. So that means I get you, which means if I get you, I'm significantly more likely to help influence decisions that are related to things you might be going through too. I get you, like I'm in a same situation. So I wanted to make sure I didn't, disguise that. I didn't conceal that reality because I think it was actually really useful to create connection and trust. But I remember I was hosting a webinar. This is maybe 2 months into the pandemic, not knowing it was going to be a year and a half of very similar stuff at the time. It was like, this could end any day, but it was like 2 months in. I hosted a webinar for our workforce that was on empathy and compassion. And it was for our women, ERG. And it was about having empathy for each other, that you're working with people who have distractions that you don't know what they are. You don't know if they're anxious because of COVID, they're anxious because their significant other lost their job. Like you have no idea what people are dealing with. So having some empathy and extending grace to people. And this is the conversation. Next thing I know, my 2 youngest come running into the bedroom, fighting, screaming. Then they're jumping on the bed and yelling, and I can't do anything about it. Like I can't, because I'm on screen. There's nobody around to be like, get them out of here. So I was just like, I don't even know what to do. So this is kind of life. And we kind of just have to all accept that this is life for now and have some empathy and grace. It was actually perfect. I got so many notes afterwards that people were like, that was awesome. It was so refreshing to know that in your position, you're still dealing with the stuff we're dealing with. And it just I feel like it made me very relatable and then trustworthy in the sense, like I'm going to help influence decisions because I get what we're all going through.
Yeah, I love it. And it's so interesting how 3 years ago, that would have never been seen as okay, right?
Oh my gosh, no.
I work out of a co-working space, and 3 years ago, it was the day after school got out, and I was working from home, and my boys were 9 and 11 at the time, and my oldest hit my youngest over the head with a Nerf gun,
Yep.
And he crawls up on my lap, and he's like, Mom, and I'm like looking in the screen, and I'm on the sales call, and I'm like, hang on a second, E, can you like, go for a second. He just looks straight in the screen and he goes, Mom, you just love your work more than you love me. And I'm like, oh, in this, it's like, no, that's not at all what we want to do. And how do we do and both? And at that point, there was no empathy or compassion for it. Mm-hmm. And, it's one of those things that now I so love. So thank you for sharing that with your workforce.
Yeah. And it still happens. So it still gets shared. And, and people, I think we're all in a much better place, but that goes back to, I really hope that doesn't change. Like I grew up going to my parents' place of work. Right. And I remember and it was, even thinking about it now, it was kind of probably crazy. My dad was a pharmacy manager at a retail pharmacy store. So think Walgreens, but it wasn't Walgreens. Yeah. And I would go sit in the pharmacy with him. I'd sit back there. Like now, today, that would be like completely unacceptable. I'm sure there's 25 policies that say nobody can be back there or authorized. But at the time, I was able to go sit back there and hang out with him for an entire shift. And I was able to help do inventory of the store. And it was such a good way to bring your children and show them the nature of work. And we lose that when we don't let that happen as part of work. And so that's where I kind of connect it to like more of a societal thing where I really hope that doesn't change.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, there's times where I'm on board meeting calls on different boards that I'm on or whatnot. And I'll name, hey, I've got kids with me in the car during this period of time. And once I hang up from that board meeting call or whatever it is, I have those conversations with my kids about, what did you think of that? And my oldest is, Mom, you have the most boring job ever. I never want to do that.
I've heard that from my kids when they come in. They're like, so you just sit there and talk to people all day? Yep. All day.
Absolutely. As we talk and kind of start to wrap up on performance leadership and accountability, one of the things that I absolutely love about Paylocity is how that accountability is built in with onboarding and orientating new employees, and for the managers with the checklists and whatnot. And it's one of those key things that I think as businesses are looking at, how do we do this differently? How do we shift to, virtual orientation and onboarding? And I'm just using that as an example because it's an easy one. And I've been doing a lot of it with Paylocity these days. It's one of those things that you have to have a process and have these things written down. And at the same time, connecting authentically with trust is so important to bring those things along.
Entirely. Yeah.
So I'm super curious. So we always close our podcast with, what's one key takeaway that you have for executive and CEOs listening into our conversation today?
Yeah. I think one of the key things is don't lose the learnings that came from this pandemic. So I truly believe that there was a reason that it had to last so long. Because had we only had to shift the way we were thinking and working with our employees for a couple months, it would have been way too easy to just go back to the way we always did things. And I think it had to last this long so that these changes were somewhat ingrained and became more habitual as opposed to just a temporary thing. Now, while I realize a lot of companies are, looking to get back into the office as much as they can and get back on an airplane and all of that, which is great, there has to be an integration of both. How do you blend this ability to connect with your employees virtually and allow some flexibility while still getting people back into a state where you need to do? And I think, at Paylocity, one of the things that we keep talking about is, okay, we're going to let there be more flexibility in the way people work. We were already half remote. And so, it's not weird for us to stay in a very remote setting, but we do want people to come back a bit. So we're looking at it saying, okay, well, we'd like you to come back, a few days a week. But if you think about it, it's not like we're going to dictate and say everybody's in the office on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. It's, hey, we might want you to come back 3 days a week, depending on your team and who you work with. It might be every other week. Well, that means there's always going to be a hybrid situation. There's always going to be some people in the office and some people on Zoom. So you have to learn how to foster this virtual connectivity with your employees and communicate with people in a virtual way. Otherwise, you're going to miss the people who are virtual and you're only going to get the people who are local. So it helps you keep kind of this even playing field by leveraging things like I'll tell you, like one of my favorite things to do to keep that even playing field is using surveys. You can get everybody's voice, whether you're in office or you're online, you get everybody's voice. Everybody gets to kind of contribute to the employee experience and how decisions are made. So I would say don't lose the gift and what we could learn from this pandemic and change the way we work forever.
I love that. And I love that you talked about, we've got to make sure that we use the hybrid option. And, it's also looking in and saying, for those individuals, how do they work? What is their natural behavioral styles? Because some of them really need to be in the office and some of them really need to be at home. So how do we do both where we're paying attention to what their natural behavioral styles are along with what the need of the job is and making it work?
Right, totally.
So what's one key takeaway that you have for HR professionals listening in today?
I think, it's be the voice. I think that's really important. And this is something I've talked to other HR leaders about, I've talked to my team about. Historically, the HR function has fought to be seen as the strategic business partner. We want a seat at the table. We want to influence the business. And we want to get away from being seen as that fluffy HR team that just plans the company holiday party. Right. Now, granted, we still have to plan the company holiday party because that's hard. Someone has to do it. We are the people, but we fought so hard to get away from that perception of just being seen as the, soft and fluffy. And I think the pendulum shifted a little too far where we became, the enforcers and the compliance police. And because we had to uphold the policies and the standards. And so I always think of it as like we kind of took the human out of HR when HR had to fight to be the voice, seated at the table and the voice in the room. Now we need to put the human back into our role and we need to be the voice. We need to be the one when the business leaders say, no, we're just going to go back to the way things were always done. It's our time to be a little soft and fluffy, for lack of a better phrase. It's like, get back in there and talk about the human side of this. And that's actually what they need from us. That is the unique thing we bring to the table is the humanistic perspective. And we need a humanistic perspective now more than ever. So be the voice. Don't be afraid to be the voice. Don't, look at it and say, how do we make sure that we're consistent with everything? Because one size fits one size does not fit all. And it's our opportunity to really push for that human approach.
Thank you so much. That's such a great insight. And if you're looking to connect with Cheryl, her LinkedIn profile will be in our show notes along with links to Paylocity. And we can't say enough about the Paylocity system and how much we love integrating that into organizations when we find that we have to work with process before we can really get to the people piece. And so with that, Cheryl, thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. And happy Friday. Have a good weekend.
You too. Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Talent Optimization Podcast. You'll find more tools and resources for CEOs and HR professionals looking to bridge the strategies versus implementation gap of talent optimization at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. We've also created a free, valuable resource for you to begin bridging the gap called the Talent Optimization Foundation Membership Program. You can access it for free at elevatedtalentconsulting.com/foundation. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode to learn more about talent optimization and creating a dream team for your organization.